Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi, and welcome back to the ISO Show. At the last podcast, we discussed the steps to Carbonology to helping organisations to become carbon neutral based on the ISO standards in this particular area, which is ISO 14064, the carbon verification standard, and PAS 2060, the carbon neutrality standard. So we're basically taking you on a journey. That's David Algar, resident carbonologist, and I were taking you on a journey through the 7 steps in Carbonology. So by the end of this series of podcasts, so there are 7 stages in Carbonology, you will have all the information that you need to then go ahead and look at verification of your carbon and put all of the steps in place to reduce your carbon footprint, including a carbon reduction plan, right through to offsetting if you wish to go through that, and then declaration of your carbon neutrality. So without further ado, welcome back, David.
Hi Mel, thank you for having me on again.
Great, yeah. So last time we were discussing step 1, the define stage, and more often than not, when we get inquiries about how to be carbon neutral, this is the main discussion. It's okay. So looking at the boundaries of the organisation, which is through scopes 1, 2, and 3. And so anyway, we covered all of that in the last episode. So we're going to move on to step 2, which is quantification. Okay, so once you've defined your scope and boundaries, could you just take us on the journey then through quantification? What are the next steps involved with calculating your emissions?
Yes, so like you said, once we define the subject and boundaries, the next step is actually do the number crunching and the calculations. So you need to carry this out for scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. We've mentioned this quite a few times, but for those of you who've missed that part on our podcast before, scope 1 are the direct emissions from sources you own. So this is a direct emission from combustion or fugitive emissions, so gases escaping from somewhere that they shouldn't have escaped from. Then you've got scope 2, which is basically your purchased energy, which is electricity for most of the time. And then scope 3, which is all the other indirect stuff. So for ISO 14064 and PAS 2060, you do need to quantify 100% of your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions within boundaries. The scope 3, the more indirect stuff, so that's stuff you don't necessarily own or have much control over, for example, business travel in vehicles you don't own. We do find that scope 3 makes up the majority of emissions for pretty much every organisation we work with, and generally it's a lot more complex to gather and process data for.
Yeah, I've heard that scope 3 emissions can be much, much harder to gather data on because you're ultimately reliant on suppliers, aren't you, for providing this information, which can be quite unreliable. Especially, I think, at this stage in the game where organisations are just starting to look at carbon verification. So there's a lot of organisations that haven't done it yet. So that could potentially be a bit of a weak link, couldn't it, when you do look at your supply chain? I mean, what tips would you give our listeners on how to tackle scope 3 emissions?
So data can be, there's various forms, but it's generally activity data. So for instance, like miles driven or kilowatt hours used, or financial data, so data based on spend. What this means in practice, sort of common examples are utilities bills, which if you're lucky will show the use. If you're not so lucky, it'll just show you a bill and you can calculate kind of backwards from that. Direct meter readings, so literally opening up the cupboard and have a look at the meter readings. Expense reports, so you mentioned suppliers, if you could look at sort of a freight report. Again, ideally that would have weights and distances on it and would involve a bit of collaboration with the supplier, but freight is quite a common one and can make up quite a big chunk of emissions for people. Again, just to put that in practical sense, real life example at Blackmores, we have an office, we have electricity, gas and water and waste and other things. In some cases we're given a unit of actual activity data like kilowatts if we're lucky. In other areas we simply get a bill and we have to kind of calculate the usage based on the most relevant up-to-date tariffs. Another example, which I personally find quite useful, and I'm sure a lot of other people do when they're doing this sort of work, are interviews and surveys. So this is where you can get sort of direct primary data from, suppliers or staff. Again, an example I use is commuting, estimating commuting mileage, which is a necessity for a lot of businesses now, particularly those that are looking for government contracts. They need to know their commuting emissions. You can calculate things, but there's nothing better than a survey direct from staff, to be honest. Yes, and something I'm always mindful of when looking at the emissions and calculating them and coming up with models is transparency, which is one of the key principles within ISO 14064. So although there's quite a few, and I'm sure we could do a whole entire podcast on those, but my personal favourite one is transparency, which is essentially, in a nutshell, just putting everything forward and being very open with your calculations and methods.
Okay. So just picking up on that subject then, on transparency, because I think there's a lot of greenwashing going on right now, isn't there? Where businesses can just pay a price and claim that they're carbon neutral, which obviously you can't do that with with these standards. You've got to demonstrate your methodology and be completely transparent about that, look at the data and the methods for your calculations, the verification, etc. So just on transparency, could you just expand on that and why that's your kind of favourite principle out of the 6 principles in 14064?
I mean, ultimately your work, or at least part, or some of your work is going to be made public because that's what the standards want you to do. Not everyone will agree with your methods, although you're following a standard which does have requirements. There are certain elements which you'll have to figure out yourself in some ways. Again, going back to commuting, that's just one example of you'll have to come up with a method somehow of getting that. The best way to basically be transparent is to record all your estimates, assumptions, exclusions, inclusions. Then another part of the standard is outlining your uncertainties. As well as being good practice, being transparent allows basically the end user of your work, who relies on this to make decisions. It means they can make those decisions with a certain degree of confidence, and hopefully a high degree of confidence. When it comes to uncertainty, again, talking practically, this can be quantitative and qualitative. It could just be a very simple analysis of looking at every single piece of data or activity stream, writing a criteria, and then basically putting a percent on that and seeing, if this certain activity is, 10% uncertain, then you can figure out that, the emissions could hypothetically be 10% either way. And that's just a good way of being transparent with how reliable the data is in your end results.
Exactly, because it must be difficult to be absolutely 100% accurate on every single aspect of your GHG emissions. So there does need to be that very, very slight variance that you need to allow for, similar to ESOS audit reports where that there was this de minimis rule of up to 10%. So it's a similar sort of scenario here then, by the sounds of it.
Exactly. I mean, even if you take the best case scenario of a meter reading, which if you do a meter reading, great, but I find a lot of companies, they don't do them on regular dates, and I'm not always 100% sure if the meter's been calibrated, whether that's water, electricity, whatever. But just an example, even if you do get direct primary data, there's still a small level of uncertainty, especially if that's collected on irregular times or just once a year.
I mean, it might be an obvious question, but what would you say is the key purpose of this quantification stage?
So as well as giving you a total footprint for a specific time period, calculating your footprint will let you do a few things. Firstly, you'll be able to see what the most emission intense areas of your organisation are. So, where the emissions are coming from, whether this is a specific location, activity, or even a specific department, if you can go into that level of detail. And then by using that information, you can prioritize those areas which, have the biggest emissions and set reduction targets. So this essentially forms the basis of your carbon footprint management plan or carbon reduction plan, which I believe we're going to go into a lot more detail on in the next few episodes.
Yeah, for sure. So, we'll come on to that definitely, because that's one of the drivers for, a lot of the reasons why businesses come to us here at Blackmores, because there is a government requirement to have a carbon reduction plan in place if you're bidding for a contract of a certain size. So, we'll definitely come on to that. But just kind of taking a step back, I think, based on the 2 different reasons that you've just given there, David, it would be really helpful if you could break that down into like a practical example of what you mean by that.
So a good example of this is waste. Obviously, there's no debate that waste is terrible for the environment, but its total carbon footprint, when you actually do the number crunching, is generally minimal for most organisations. Yet, we all spend a lot of time and resources on training, signage, and programs to reduce waste, which is obviously positive. Quick wins are something that every organisation should aim for, but prioritising the biggest emission sources will ultimately result in the biggest reductions. Another benefit of this is, being able to identify inefficiencies within your organisation. A simple way to do this is to compare your results against the headcount for each facility. And again, just speaking practically, I looked at one organisation recently and I looked at their water use, and I could see that, for one particular office out of the number of offices they've got, they're using 12 times the amount of water per member of staff. So that just highlighted that when you compare it to a headcount.
That's really interesting, isn't it? So, I mean, this would help to dovetail into other ISO management systems that an organisation might have, like ISO 14001, because it's really getting down to the detail with, looking at the data, isn't it, on site by site and different activities and things like that. So, without a shadow of a doubt, that should lead to cost savings, I would have thought as well. Do you find that in your experience?
Yes, it can do. Yeah. So again, identifying inefficiencies, you could find a leak or, a piece of equipment that's using a lot of energy. Or again, talking about leaks, some companies, if they're operating server rooms and aircon systems, just a tiny, tiny leak of fugitive gases can lead up to an absolutely massive carbon footprint. So if you can identify that and sort it out, it's going to save yourself some money as well as emissions.
Yeah, without a doubt.
And then, of course, another sort of major benefit of this is budgets. So if you are aiming to be carbon neutral, once you know your carbon footprint, you'll basically know the budget or the amount of money you'll need to spend to purchase offsets and become carbon neutral, which is also another great incentive to make reductions, because the lower your footprint, the less you'll have to spend on carbon offset credits each year. So again, great incentive to save money and make reductions.
Yeah, and I think that's another unique thing about this approach within Carbonology. It's not just about getting a number and then offsetting. It's about the other stages in between, which we'll be coming on to over the next couple of podcasts, which is making that commitment to reducing your carbon footprint, actually reducing it, and then doing the re-quantification, they're the 3 steps that are missing within a lot of organisations. They're just going straight to what's our carbon footprint. And some aren't even getting accurate data on doing that either. And then going straight into spending a lot of money on offsetting, which doesn't help the environment an awful lot. I think they might think that they do, and they might look good from a PR perspective and short term, but there's no proven methodology or systems behind that or clear transparency on how that's been done, has it? So at this stage then, on the quantification, just to wrap up, what would you say are the main outcomes and deliverables at this stage of Carbonology?
So one of the main outcomes is your greenhouse gas inventory. So this is a requirement of ISO 14064, and put simply, it's basically a big list of all your emission sources categorized and the specific greenhouse gases they produce. Here you'll also list all emission conversion factors you use to turn the activity data into tons of specific greenhouse gases. And then, depending on your goals as an organisation, you'll also need to be able to produce and circulate a greenhouse gas report. Another useful outcome is that you'll be able to basically instantly respond to the tenders that we mentioned a moment ago. Again, if you're working with the government in certain contracts, you will need a carbon footprint to basically provide as part of the tender. And being able to easily and quickly and transparently and accurately present your carbon footprint to a potential tender is it can only do you favours when you're looking to win new business, particularly if you've completed this in line with an internationally recognised standard. And as I mentioned ago, we've been discussing this does form the basis of the next step, which is commit.
Yeah, obviously you can't move on unless you know what your carbon footprint actually is.
Exactly.
So that is really important, isn't it? And I think this can be a bit of an eye-opener for all organisations to look at, how, the activities that they carry out, whether they're in manufacturing or it's a law firm, or it doesn't really matter whether it's a professional services organisation or they produce a product. There are costs to running a business. There are significant overhead costs. And this just helps you to identify what those activities are, what the costs are to the business, but most importantly now, what the cost is to the environment. And I think this is it's such a crucial stage, isn't it, in Carbonology, which is the bedrock to the next stage, because you can't really make any commitment to reductions if you don't know where you're at the moment. So, that's been really helpful, David. Thank you so much for taking us through that. That's been really insightful, and I know that obviously it's a very technical aspect of the 7 steps in Carbonology. In fact, probably the most technical aspect. So that's why I'm looking forward to moving on to the next one, which is commit, which is step 3. So thanks very much for joining us, David. I know that you've opened up your diary over the next few weeks for some slots for ISO Show listeners to book a discovery meeting in with you if they'd like to discuss their carbon neutrality journey. So thank you very much for that. And we'll provide links to that in the show notes.
Cool. Thanks, Mel. Thanks for having me on again. Looking forward to the next one.
Great. Yeah. So David and I will look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.